finding the equilibrium level of output and rate of interest from that. So we were in the process of doing that when actually, this mid-sem break actually took place, and then something happened. Someone is from some source, there is a noise coming, so please mute yourself, and if you have to speak, then you can actually always unmute and interject. Okay, so let me actually cover things graphically, and the idea is that even if it may be that you may face some problem with equations. So personally, I think that if conceptually you are clear, those equations are merely they are merely some kind of it's basically doing plain algebra, so it shouldn't be very difficult. But if you find some difficulty, you can always write to me, and I'll see that how those things can be actually covered. Now, if you look at this diagram, it's an interesting diagram because it tells you about what happens when there is a increase in money supply, and that increase in money supply is shown as the shift in the LM curve. So MS is increasing, we are keeping P to be actually constant, and this is what will be the outcome. So the new equilibrium is going to be from the E was the old equilibrium, the new equilibrium is going to be the E prime. So that is the comparative statics. And this is how actually the monetary expansion, monetary stimulus work. What happens that increase in money supply, given the level of money demand, is going to increase reduce the rate of interest, and that reduction in the rate of interest means that the investment increases. So investment increases means the aggregate demand increases, and this increase in aggregate demand would mean that the output will start to increase. So this is the story. So basically, you can see that in terms of movement along the this IS curve, that how the output is actually increasing as the rate of interest is actually declining. So this is how it works. Now, but the dynamics is not really from E to E prime. The dynamics is somewhat different. The dynamics is that because of this specific thing that we have, that the money market adjusts immediately, whereas the goods market takes time to adjust. So what happens that there is a movement immediately when the money supply increases, the money market adjustment happens immediately. So you have a movement like this that happens immediately. So from E to E1, you go there. And with E1, at E1, what happens that the rate of interest has really fallen very much, because of which there is going to be increase in the demand. Basically because of the increase in investment. So to look at it from the IS point of view, this is your IS curve, and this particular point, that is E1, is to the left of the IS curve. So any point which is to the left of the IS curve, its feature is that the rate of interest actually what is the feature of this particular point E1? When we look at it from the goods market, anyone would actually want to explain that. Suppose you are at this point at E1 that I am showing here. So what will happen in the goods market and why it will happen? Can someone describe the process? Please unmute. Please mute your phone or mic or whatever, because there is some kind of noise that is coming. Anyway, who would want to actually explain that what happens to the goods market when you have E1, and what happens and why that happens? Every step explain carefully. Who want to explain? Anyone? I can't hear you. Is someone? Okay, is it that What is happening? I can't understand. No response also. Is no one wants to answer, or there is some problem, technical problem?
Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, I can hear you, but please speak a little louder than what you're speaking because the whole class has to hear.
Yes. So at E1,
Yes.
the interest rate is lower than the equilibrium interest rate. So because of that, the investment will increase.
Yes. So
Now, when
this is the rate of interest at Y naught. It is the I naught which makes the aggregate demand equal to Y. But at E1, the investment is higher because the rate of interest is lower, and which means that the aggregate demand is higher. And aggregate demand is higher than the output means that the output is going to increase. So that is why the output is increasing. So that is correct. And as the output actually increases, what you observe is that there is going to be a every time there is an increase in output, there is a movement like this. The money demand, at the level of money demand is actually going to increase, because after all, the money demand is function of both output and rate of interest. So the money supply has increased, so it is at fixed at certain new level. And now what happens that the output on the right hand side of the money equation, the output is increasing. So the total money demand is actually increasing because of that. So initially the rate of interest had fallen so that money supply is equal to money demand. But now what happens, as the output increases, the rate of interest also starts to increase. So this is exactly what is shown here. So every time there is an output increase, there is a simultaneous rate of interest increase that is going to happen. So the dynamics that comes out of it is quite interesting. The dynamics that is actually coming out from this is that there is a movement like this first, and then there is a movement like this. So if I actually draw it here, what happens to the rate of interest? So as far as the output is concerned, the dynamics is very clear that this is the dynamics of the output. But insofar as the rate of interest is concerned, it's rather peculiar that what happens that from here it falls to this point, and then it starts to actually increase. So it's a very peculiar rate of interest change that happens. At first it falls, and then only it starts to actually increase. This is something which is very, very interesting, in the sense that this gives rise to various kinds of very interesting dynamics in macroeconomics. For example, when the exchange rate is related to the rate of interest, then, and as the interest rate actually changes, the exchange rate also changes. We have a theory of that, which we don't cover in this course, but in the subsequent courses, you will be discussing that in detail, that how the exchange rate are related to rate of interest. Then you will see that exchange rate also behaves in this very peculiar fashion, that there might be a jump in there might be a complete immediate devaluation of the currency, and then currency starts to appreciate and settles at a level which is actually higher than the previous level. So that happens because of this kind of change in the interest rate. So the fact that money market actually is adjusting quickly, whereas the goods market are adjusting slowly, is not a very innocuous thing. It has actually a very severe impact as far as the real economy is actually concerned, in terms of the dynamics of the real economy. So this is the point that I wanted to actually highlight, because this is going to be something which is going to be quite useful. So this is not merely a shift of output because of increase in the money supply. This is also giving rise to certain dynamics of the rate of interest. And what you are going to study in future is that not just rate of interest, but also exchange rate, because exchange rate would have certain relationship with the rate of interest. Now, on the next page, essentially, this whole thing of monetary expansion is actually highlighted, that how exactly monetary stimulus actually work. I mean, recently RBI has announced some kind of monetary stimulus in the event of this epidemic that we are actually facing, that you change the real money supply, and basically, RBI, the central bank, does not change the prices. It can change the nominal money supply, the actual money supply. That increases, but given that there is a certain level of price which does not change immediately, the real money supply increases. Now, this real money supply increases leads to the change in the asset prices and the interest rate. So this is a very crucial step, that this real money supply should be actually leading to the change, certain changes. So this is something which is a very, very important step that we have, because if this is blocked here, adjustment does not happen and the asset prices does not change, then basically you are in a situation what we call the liquidity trap. So that is the situation. This line actually breaks this causation. So from one you never reach to two, and that is actually the situation which we have actually described as the liquidity trap. That though people have more money because the money supply has increased, the credit supply has increased, that does not mean that there is going to be change in the price of the assets. In the Keynes's example, that asset was actually bond. So there is the bond prices do not increase, so rate of interest does not actually declines. But suppose you are not in a situation of liquidity trap. So if you're not in a situation of liquidity trap, then the interest rate changes here at number 2. And at number 3, what happens? That the spending adjusts to the change in the interest rate. Spending, because, in our model, what we have assumed is that that spending is basically the investment, which is related to rate of interest. You can make more complicated model where other things are also other kind of other factors of other features of demand. Component of demands are actually dependent on rate of interest. Possibly the consumption expenditure is also dependent on rate of interest. So that will also increase. And then naturally, because of this, the aggregate demand changes and the output changes. But remember that this break is what then is going to give rise to what we call the liquidity trap. So that is something which is actually worth remembering. Now, what is here? You see that the liquidity trap. Yes.
Can you please explain this cycle again?
Pardon?
Can you please explain this cycle again?
There is this causation. There is no cycle. There is a causation. Which part is not very clear, because I'll just be repeating myself. So if you can specifically tell me that there is some part in which you have confusion, then I can focus on that. Is that possible, Kavya?
Yes, sir. So I understood the causation, that how it's happening, but how have you related it to liquidity trap?
Oh, liquidity trap is when this cycle, this causation does not take place, because from 1 you never move to 2. So what happens in liquidity trap, that you increase the money supply, but people may have more money or they may have more access to credit because of that, because government has actually increased the money supply, but that does not lead to change in the asset prices. That does not lead to change in the in terms of Keynes, in the description of Keynes, it was the bond prices. So people have more money, but they don't buy bond. And if they don't buy bond, or if you don't buy other kinds of assets, then naturally the rate of interest is not impacted by that. So in the mathematical terms, we can put it as that the money supply is increasing, simultaneously money demand is increasing. And how is the money demand increasing? Not because the rate of interest is declining, not because the output is increasing, but the very L function that you have, that itself is changing. And then, earlier lectures, we had also said that how this L function is related to the velocity of money. So essentially what happens, that you have a higher money supply in terms of higher currency supply, but the velocity of money declines. So the liquidity trap is not this causation. Liquidity trap is actually break of this causation when you are moving from 1 to 2. And that is why the monetary policy becomes ineffective. And as a matter of fact, that is why it is called a trap, because the monetary policy is not working. I hope that is clear.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yes.
So in one of the previous classes, you said that the rate of interest refers to the cost of borrowing money.
Yes.
So how have you related it with the asset prices again?
When did I say that the rate of interest refers to the cost of borrowing?
So when you started ISLM.
And during the, I must have said that while describing the IS curve. So rate of interest is actually because the investment depends on the rate of interest. So it is a cost of money. Why it is so? Because it is a cost of money. But
so have you actually related it? Are you actually calling the returns and asset prices as the opportunity cost if you keep money with yourself? Is that how it is
let me
linked with the
actually
price?
answer the first question, that in which situation did I say that rate of interest is actually a cost of borrowing? It is a cost of borrowing. In fact, it is a cost of borrowing. That's how it affects investment. As a matter of fact, in at least in one interpretation of LM curve, the I is the fact that money demand is dependent on rate of interest is basically because the liquidity has a cost. You want some liquidity, but then for that you have to pay a certain cost, and that cost is basically that the interest that you forego, and that's why the money demand will be dependent on the rate of interest. Now, here when we say that the portfolio adjustment leads to change in the asset prices and interest rate, essentially what you are saying is that when the money supply actually increases, then it is likely that you are actually going to use that money to buy assets. And this, now let's forget about the rate of interest for the time being. So you go and buy the asset prices. Now that asset prices means that in the financial market, now people can actually raise money, and because of which the investment will go up, right? Because you are willing to buy shares and so on. So the investment will be high because now there will be more availability of funds. And if investment is high, then the aggregate demand and output is going to be high. So even without looking at the rate of interest, you can actually see it. But then, let us look at it again from the point of view of the rate of interest. That you have the change in money supply, and then what happens that this increase in money supply actually leads to, given level of the money demand, this increase in money supply will reduce to the fall of the interest rate. And this fall in the interest rate then would lead to the increase in the investment, right? So it will lead to the increase in investment because the cost of borrowing actually becomes less, and which is how we have actually derived the IS curve, and that then again the rest of the causation is on the same line. The point is that, look, here in the economy, when you make a policy change, the multiple changes actually happen. Now, when you talk of the monetary stimulus, it may work in different ways. And by saying that, if I'm describing one way, I'm not ruling out the other way. So I may describe that, look, money supply increases, people have more credit, they go and buy these financial assets. So the availability of money for the real investors, the entrepreneurs, the capitalists, that increases because people are willing to invest in their company. So they can actually borrow more money and invest, and that's how the investment aggregate demand output will increase. So that's one way of looking at it. The second way of looking at it is that this increase in money supply is actually going to reduce the rate of interest, because if the money supply increases, the right hand side, the money demand also has to increase. There is more availability of fund in the money market. So because of that, the rate of interest is actually declining. And with that rate of interest decline, the investment is actually going to increase, and then aggregate demand, output, and so on and so forth. So, when you have monetary stimulus, it may work in both ways. The point is that this generalization is something which is taking into account both kind of thing. Now look at it from the Keynes's story. Keynes's story, people could actually make only two investment. They could keep money or they could actually buy bond, right? So there what you said that what he did is that he linked the bond prices with the rate of interest in a way which has been described to you. I think you should be clear about it. That so what happens that when you increase the money supply, people actually start buying more bonds, and because of which the rate of interest declines, and then rest of the causation. Now, what is liquidity trap? Liquidity trap is a situation when this increase in money supply does not lead to your demanding more of assets, or it does not lead to decline in interest rate because there is a simultaneous increase in money demand, or it does not lead to, in the world of Keynes, the increase in the bond prices because you don't buy bond because you don't expect bond prices to become higher in future. So even if you have more money, that does not make you demand some assets, whether it is any other assets or it is bond, because if you don't expect their prices to go up in the future. So there is a break that takes place between 1 and 2, and that is the situation of liquidity trap. Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, when you think of the macroeconomics is not that, things will happen in one particular way. Multiple things are going to happen. Now, if they all happen in one direction, that increase in money supply leads to higher asset prices or the lower rate of interest, and all of that is going to actually lead to increase in the investment and hence aggregate demand and output, then all that can be clubbed together. And actually then, the policy can be looked at, monetary expansion can be looked at that. And similarly, when you talk of the liquidity trap, it does not have to be in the same way as the Keynes has described. There are various ways in which the monetary stimulus could work, but if none of them is actually working because people have the poor expectations about the future, so neither there is people expect increase in asset prices, or there is no decline in rate of interest, or there is actually no increase in the demand for the government bond in case of Keynes. All that is I said three things. Any one of them, overall impact you have to see, and then say that whether it's a situation of liquidity trap or not a liquidity trap. So basically what one is trying to say is that don't try to actually see that there is one particular way in which things will actually work in macroeconomics. It will not, because economies are not like that. You give monetary stimulus and a lot of things actually happen. But if you can see that all that is happening in a way which is causing the investment to increase, whether it is through asset market or the bond market or the rate of interest declining, then that is a situation which is where the monetary stimulus is working. And where it is not working, basically people have more money but they sit on their cash, then that is a situation of the liquidity trap. So when I put it in a mathematical form, mathematics, algebra, those equations are not economy. Those equations represent that this is the direction in which you can expect economy to move. Why it moves in that direction, you can have multiple explanations for that. But as long as all those explanations are actually going in the same direction, I think we should be fine with that equation. So that is how one should read the mathematics in macroeconomics, which is very different from the mathematics that you do in microeconomics. In microeconomics, when you write something, it means that and nothing else. When you say U-shaped cost curve, it is U-shaped cost curve. Okay, when you say indifference curve, which is a convex to origin, then there is certain mathematics to it. You might have done some of it, that the preferences are a utility function is strictly quasi-concave, or the preferences are essentially the better set, as good as set is actually a convex set, and so on. So there is a precise mathematics and exactly that meaning. Now this is not how it works here. You are looking at different directions in which the economy moves, and that directions is something which is characterized by the equations. But the direction per se can be actually quite diverse themselves. look at the liquidity trap. I mean, something which is here that is being said is, I think, is completely wrong. Yes. Yes. Some question? Okay. So something here that is completely wrong, because what is said here, and I'll read it. Historically, the liquidity trap has been a useful expositional device, mostly for understanding the consequence of a relatively flat LM curve. So, LM curve is flat. So even if you increase the money supply, that really does not lead to increase in output. You can draw it and actually see, with little immediate relevance to policymakers. So here, you see that an ideological position of the three authors is completely clear, that how they are looking at Keynesianism. That, okay, it might be there, but it has no relevance. But there is one situation in which liquidity trap can be of critical practical concern, because they can't think that how can actually, it may happen that you increase the money supply and that does not stimulate the economy. But they say that it may happen in one situation when interest rate is close to zero and they can't get any lower. So that is a situation where the liquidity trap, the concept of liquidity trap, is actually important. I do not know when is this edition appearing. This edition definitely has appeared after Don Bush passed away, unfortunately. He was in his 50s, very bright man, a Nobel laureate, who died much before 2008. Or I think, just after 2008, and this edition might have come after that. But, what you observe in 2008 or what you observe now, is it that the liquidity trap is something which is a very, very, once in a century kind of phenomena that one can actually ignore? For example, in the American economy itself, that you take the 2008 crisis, then it was an economy which was in liquidity trap, even though the rate of interest was not zero. Why was it in liquidity trap? Because you could actually pump in money. But that pumping in money does not lead to an increase in expenditure, investment in particular, but expenditure in general. And why does that happen? Something like that may be happening actually even today in not just India, but all economies which are affected by, almost the whole world, which is affected by this pandemic that we have. That there is a crisis of what is called the crisis of confidence. What is this crisis of confidence? The crisis of confidence is that when the businessmen are not sure that whether they can actually undertake the regular business, because a businessman does not actually produce things in isolation. He actually works with many other business people. So he has many payment obligations. He has many many other businesses are supposed to pay to him. He's supposed to pay to many other businesses. He's supposed to pay to the payback to the bank. Banks are supposed to lend. Workers have to be paid, and so on and so forth. So there is this whole linkage is there. Now what happens that in that linkage, the moment you realize that the normal business may not be continued, and there is a crisis of confidence, then what you do is that you sit on your cash. So right now, if you actually randomly ask any businessman that what is it that they are doing, big corporations will not tell you that what they are doing, but the smaller businessmen will actually tell you that they are doing. They will say, "Ki paisa phasa hua hai. We are not getting our money." So you ask him, and what are you doing? You must have some payment obligation. He says that, I'm not paying, because until I get money, I'm not paying. So everyone is sitting on the money, right? And that is basically because you are not sure that if you actually suppose, there is an input supplier. Now, if I don't pay to the input supplier, he is not going to supply me next month. But I do not mind that. Basically, because I say, okay, don't supply next month. I'm not even sure whether the next month I want that or not. Either I want to buy that input or not, because I'm not sure about the demand for my product. So basically, you are actually sitting on that money. Now, this is the situation where generally there is a crisis of the confidence. And this crisis of confidence is leading to liquidity trap. Because what is liquidity trap at the end of the day? Liquidity trap is the government stimulates the economy, it increases the money supply, but then that does not lead to actually level of activity becoming higher, investment become higher, expenditure becoming higher. That is liquidity trap. And this is precisely what is happening. In these situations, banks would also start behaving very, very differently. So they say, I know that we have been lending to you, we have been giving you the working capital for a very long time, and you have always returned it. But look at the business right now. We are not sure whether if you lend it now, if you give you some money now for your, paying for certain inputs or paying for workers and so on, what we know as a working capital, whether you will be able to return it because the business is doing very bad. So it is in the commercial interest of the banks also to sit on their money. So whoever has the money will sit on their money. This is precisely what happens during the 2007-8 crisis. That it is not that all the companies which were affected were the companies who were doing ambiguous and basically the shady investment and so on. The good ones also. A small restaurant which has not undertaken any risky financial asset will suddenly find itself that it is not getting credit, will suddenly find itself that it is not getting orders. So what will happen that if it has to pay some money to its input suppliers, to the grocery or to the meat supplier, or to the vegetable supplier, it will say, okay, I'm not going to pay you right now, I'm going to sit on their money because I'm not even sure that whether the business will continue in the next month or not. So this is the situation, classic situation of the liquidity trap. So to say that liquidity trap can be of critical practical concern only in one situation, that interest rates are close to zero, is, to my point, to put it very sympathetically, is misleading. Because you have various instances when this crisis of confidence has actually led to the situation of liquidity trap. So is there any question? Is there any question? Yes, someone? Yes, how come?
Sir,
Yes.
just a minor query. Just like it said that when the interest rates are close to zero, just a clarification, but interest rates can go below zero as well, right?
They can go below zero. I mean, that may happen. It will not happen in the situation when you have the commercial banks, because commercial banks will not pay you 100 rupees and say return 90 rupees to us, which is what is your negative rate of interest. But it may happen in a situation where the government is actually trying to actually increase the private investment, and it can do that. It can actually give you 100 rupees and say, okay, take 100 rupees, invest. As long as you're investing, we don't mind you paying back 90 rupees. But that can be done by the government. Or what can government do is that tell commercial banks that you lend it at the negative rate of interest, and we are actually going to subsidize you for every lending that you make. So we'll compensate you. It often happens because many times you actually see that the rate of interest going negative is when the rate of interest is actually say 2%, but the inflation rate is 5%. So the real rate of interest then in that situation becomes 3%. So it does not make sense to actually in the proper sense to be lending. But again, you are looking at not the correct thing. That is not what liquidity trap is. That is really taking an idea, taking a beautiful idea, discussing it, explaining it, and then trivializing it by saying that, look, this is relevant here, and we don't know if it is relevant anywhere else, where I think the world events have seen again and again that it is actually quite relevant. And the way it has come up for example, I mean, it's a crisis of confidence, but also there's another kind of crisis. For example, what we know as today we talk about the twin balance sheet crisis, which that Arvind Subramaniam was talking about. That you have this balance sheet crisis of the if you Google twin balance sheet crisis, I have spoken about it in lectures also. That you have the balance sheet problem of this real estate company and the banks. So companies and the banks, because their balance sheet has become completely corrupted. So once the balance sheet is corrupted, once you know that your liabilities have become very high, your assets are not that much, what would you want to do with your cash? You would want to hold it. You want to hold as much cash because you know that no one is going to finance you. If you're a bank, then if you have that situation where your balance sheet is corrupted, when you realize that your liabilities are much higher than your assets, what are you going to do? You don't want to lend whatever money you have. You want to sit on that, because there will be various payment obligations that you have to address in the near future, and if you don't do it, then there will be legal implications. So you will sit on that cash. So this is the situation, which is basically, which is, if this situation becomes more widespread, this is exactly the situation of the liquidity trap, because this is a situation in which if you actually pump in more money, that is not actually going to help, because even if you pump more money, if you give more money to the banks, you're not going to give them free. It's not the helicopter that you are dropping money and whoever gets it can have it. They have to return that money, but they are unable to do that business basically because of this mismatch between their payment obligation and what they are getting as the inflow. So there are multiple ways in which this crisis of confidence and the liquidity trap has come up. So what actually I think the textbook has done, and I will say that this is the ideological position. By the way, the Don Bush, the most prominent among these three people, Don Bush has been known for his orthodox views of the monetarism and so on. I mean, not disrespecting his intellectual caliber and so on. In fact, the thing that I was describing about the rate of interest and how it has an impact on exchange rate movement and so on is something which is originally Don Bush's contribution, for which he actually got the Nobel Prize also. So I think we are getting over with the time. This has been an interesting class. If you have specific queries about it, please send me the questions, but please think it through. Think it through. Unless you think it through and see and try to see that how it is logical or how it is not logical, what could be the logical holes, then only you will understand. Otherwise, understanding it in part wise, not telling the story yourself, is actually may not be the most helpful. So all right then, what I will do today, something which I have been postponing so far, but that's not a good thing, is that what I will do is that I will